as I invite the principals of the Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation to the stage to welcome them all in a moment. But I'd like to also recognize our online audience that are joining us. You're also very welcome. And just some housekeeping that you should be familiar with. We are broadcasting this event on YouTube live as well. And we are delighted to have the audience on Zoom join us for this too. And we want this to be interactive. And so after our moderators have engaged our guest speaker, we're going to be throwing this out to our in-person audience and of course the online audience as well. So if you are watching on YouTube, please feel free to type in your comments or questions. We certainly will be reviewing them and we hope to take some of them as we proceed. Likewise, for those joining us on Zoom, please do the same and type in your questions in the chat function under the chat field, and we'll be happy to take those questions at the appropriate time. So without further ado, we want to make this a very efficient event. And for our audience in person, you also have the opportunity to ask questions. So you have been given a small bag. Please look into it. You'll find a pen and some writing material. You can also write in your questions. Please make them available to a hostess who would certainly channel them back to me, and hopefully we can get them onto the stage as well. So without further ado, I'd like to now welcome, if you like, our chief host to do an appropriate welcome, if you like. The promoters and the drivers of what I think are, incidentally, in my opinion, from my interaction with them, really, really different type of philanthropy. What we're seeing in the Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation is something that I think many years after this, we'll begin to talk about the impact. And we're talking about how they are not only influencing the private sector, but the public sector. So if you don't know much about the Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation, I strongly recommend you find out a little more about what they're doing, and I'm sure you'll be pleasantly surprised. But on that note, I'd like to now welcome them to the stage. Please welcome with generous applause, Mr. Aig-Imoukhuede and Ifowe Aig-Imoukhuede.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Good morning, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Aig-Imoukhuede and I are delighted to welcome you today to the Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation in Conversation with Professor Stefan Dercon. The Foundation's mission is to improve the lives of Africans through improved public service delivery and increased access to quality primary health care. I won't go into too much detail about the work that we do as an organization, because there's plenty of material in the bags about our work, and you can also go to our website, www.aig-imoukhuedefoundation.org, to learn more about what we do. But a critical element of our work is trying to build capacity in the public sector. In addition to our programs that we run in conjunction with the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford, we're always looking for opportunities to build the capacity of public sector leadership and help to equip them with the skills and knowledge they need to drive change. So to this end, in July, we facilitated a tour of the UK civil service for the head of the Nigerian civil service and about a fifth of her top permanent secretaries. They visited current and past members of the UK civil service, the top leadership, and learned about their experiences with reform. So as part of that tour, we were privileged to spend a day at the Blavatnik School of Government, learning from the world's top academics in the field of development. And we had presentations on digital technology, performance management, education reform, and so on and so on. But the most compelling presentation we got was from the Dercon. So he, in his book, Gambling on Development, argues that the answer to a nation's development lies not in a specific set of policies, but in a key development bargain where the elite shift from protecting their own positions to gambling on a growth-based future. And he provides examples of countries where the elite have made successful bargains that have resulted in growth, and countries that have not. And a point that he made to us during his presentation is that Nigeria doesn't come out very well. So we were very, very interested in hearing what he had to say, and we thought immediately that we had to bring him to Nigeria so that he could speak to the people who actually have the power, the capacity to drive this change. In addition to this conversation, we're also taking him to Abuja to talk to the country's top civil servants, because they also have the power to drive change. So thank you very much, Professor Dercon, for being so accepting. Immediately, he was like, of course I will be there. And we're very pleased to welcome him here today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Aig-Imoukhuede, who will share a little bit about what we're going to do here this morning and introduce our excellent chairman, our moderators, and give some more details about Professor Dercon himself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Foe. And I join my certainly more intelligent than me wife, certainly more attractive than me wife. In welcoming you all to what promises to be a really great day. When I was, and I shared this with some of the very brilliant participants and protagonists that are going to steer the course of events, I feel very nervous, and it's nervous excitement. It's not a negative vibe. I actually feel the way I felt when we started to engage with stakeholders around this dream of Access Bank. And for those of you who knew, it wasn't a very straightforward process. It was fraught with disagreements, people from different backgrounds, strangers, friends, and trust and mistrust. And what was I nervous about? The reality was that if we could come together somehow and reach a consensus, an agreement, a bargain, there could be a certain outcome. And if we didn't, we were also clear that there would be another outcome. And glory be to God, you can see the outcome that we had today. And it's very similar, actually, what is happening here. We have basically assembled in this room. And for 1 second, because I feel very uncomfortable when Pascal Dozier is blocked by a podium that shouldn't be there. So will somebody please take the podium off? And thank you very much. So there are between 70 to 100 people who will be in this room today. And, the choice of who is in this room is consistent in only one thing, which is that everybody here has reached very high levels of standard in whatever thing that person has chosen to pursue. That's what's common to everybody here, okay? And we were very organic in the invitation process. We really didn't follow up with, hey, are you coming or aren't you coming? Because we wanted those who came to be people who wanted to be here. And it's not to say that those who are not here will not join us. But certainly those who are here are already connected with this end result we seek to achieve. So I described you as being people who have attained a very high level of achievement in your chosen activity. There's an economist, you remember him, is Vilfredo Pareto. He describes that as the elite. So whether you like the term or not, you are the elite by every economist's definition. Another way, of course, of looking in a nation at who the elite is, I think we have national honors today. You can, many people here have national honors. I'm blessed with one, and so on. every elite has saints and sinners, so we didn't select based on who is a saint or who is a sinner. And I'm not in any way putting or categorizing people, but I'm setting up this conversation appropriately, because the things that Professor Dercon says in his book are, frankly speaking, very powerful and profound. In all our work, Ufo and I have focused on capability, the capability of Nigerians to get things done. The chairman of our leadership council, who I will introduce, has always told us that capability is not enough. It always must start with the ability to form a consensus. And then also I know that in this country, where that consensus exists and that capability has come to match it, we've actually done incredible things as a nation. Really, really incredible things. Unfortunately, not consistently. Again, Professor Dercon writes and speaks about this. Why am I nervous? I'm nervous because if we fail, if this process, this dialogue and what follows does not come up with a framework for taking Nigeria out of this stop-start, reverse progress towards development. If we fail, Professor Dercon, many people here and others tell us an inevitable truth. Professor Dercon describes it as the Africanization of poverty. Along with my chairman, along with Ofowe, we are heading to the Nigerianization of poverty. And indeed, if we do not reach that consensus, if we continue to say we can't do it, the future of Nigeria seems very dire indeed. And because I cannot live with that possibility, irrespective of whatever blessings professionally, financially, socially God has bestowed, I cannot live with that possibility. My wife cannot, and several of you here. We've started this dialogue as a catalyst to hopefully a process, and I don't know what role I will be playing. She doesn't know what role. I don't know what role anybody here or those who are not here will play. But we cannot fail to organize ourselves as an elite, as other nations have done. And it's never too late. Vietnam. Just now, Vietnam. It's never too late. But maybe at some point in time, the consequences will be too dire for us to face. And I hope that time will not come. Yeah. It's now my job to introduce 4 people. And Ofowe and I will join you in the audience as we do so. The first is the star of today, Professor Stefan Dercon. He's Belgian, but he has spent most of his life in Africa, living, learning, qualifying as a PhD economist. He's Belgian-British. He's a professor of economic policy at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. He was, at the time, the chief economist of DFID, that we all know, and has been a development policy advisor to successive UK foreign secretaries. His research concerns what keeps some people and some countries poor. The failures of markets, governments, and politics, mainly in Africa. And I think, as we give him a round of applause to join us on stage, the most powerful thing about the work he does is that he has committed his life, even when disagreeing with some of the greatest economists and academicians on earth, that there are solutions that Africa can form itself. And this is what his life is dedicated to. Professor Stefan Dercon. One brilliant woman has left the stage. I'm pleased and privileged to introduce another one. A brilliant award-winning scholar who had a distinguished career in tax and management consulting at Anderson and then Accenture. She served her country as the first female executive chairman of the FIRS. Her tenure was marked by three powerful things: the development of a national tax policy for the first time, comprehensive overhaul of all tax statutes, and most importantly, something which is still with that organization today, the transformational way she changed the culture of the FIRS, stands testament to who she is and what she does. And she is an Aig-Imoukhuede fellow at the Blavatsky School of Government, University of Oxford, 2018 to 2019, Aig-Imoukhuede Okaro. Interestingly, the best summary of the gentleman I'm about to introduce was not done in Nigeria, in the research that I made personally. It was actually done when he was inducted into the American Academy of Science and Arts. Professor Atahiru Jega is the former Vice Chancellor of Bayero University, Kano. He's a political scientist, and he is a recognized authority on democratization in Nigeria. Under his leadership as chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission from 2010 through 2015, Nigeria underwent a remarkable democratic transition marked by strategic reforms, which allowed for something that was believed to be impossible: an incumbent first-time president to accept election results that he lost, and that we witnessed a smooth handover of power. And what is even more remarkable is that the whole world saw the challenges that this gentleman had to, I'm talking about Professor Jega, maneuver around and provide leadership on. I'm sure you remember that when the whole world saw the counting of election results, and we failed to understand that what could have happened that day had Professor Jega not managed that scenario the way he did, and the whole world watching, could have been disastrous for this nation. He is also an AIG fellow, an Aig fellow at the Blavatsky School of Government from 2016 to 2017, and is a member of the Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation Leadership Council. Professor Atahiru Jega. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the chairman of the Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation Leadership Council. Chief Olusegun Obasanjo is a two-time Nigerian president. He fought for his country in a civil war as a military officer. He was jailed for his country, fighting for its freedom, and spent a harrowing time, and yet stayed strong. In the three periods where Nigeria has shown the greatest promise and has shown the possibility of what could be, these periods just around independence up till 1965, 1973 up till 1979, 80, and 1999 up till 2008. Two of the times that Nigeria was at its greatest and finest. It just happened to coincide with the times when Chief Olusegun Obasanjo provided leadership at the helm of affairs. I don't know if it's a coincidence. But distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I will stand up now and allow the chairman of the session, Chief Olusegun Obasanjo, to come and do his job. Thank you very much.
Please be seated.
The one I have on seems not to be working. Let me start from you. And my dear sister, not only for your presentation this morning, but for the work you have done, you are doing, and I am sure you will continue to do with the Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation, which I have the pleasure and the honor of chairing. And let me also welcome Professor Dercon for being with us, for the work you have done in Africa, directly and indirectly, particularly through the DFID and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the UK, and the work and research that I know you are doing in different countries in Africa. And just before we came here, we came in, we talked about the country in which you have interest and on which I'm working now, Ethiopia. Let me, of course, welcome also Atahiro and my sister, Stefan. For me, it is a pleasure to be here, and particularly to be able to interact with the discussants, and particularly with the author of this book, Gambling on Development, Why Some Countries Win and Others Lose, particularly in Africa. And one of the countries that is losing in Africa is Nigeria. And if we are not going to deceive ourselves, of course, on many occasions we deceive ourselves and we don't like to tell it as it is about ourselves. And when others tell us, we don't want to take kindly to it. But it is true. And the question is, why have other countries made it and we seem not to have been able to make it and continue to make it, in spite of what God has endowed us with? Late friend of mine, Aig-Imoukhuede, used to be angry when you talk about Nigeria and you say, let us pray to God. He will say you are tempting God. God has given you everything and you mess it up. you mismanage it, and you are praying to God. That is tempting God. And I used to say to him, well, what is good needs prayer so that it can continue to be good. And what remains to be good needs prayer so that it can be good. But in our case, we need prayer. Yes, but in addition to prayer, we need to do what is right, and do what is right consistently and continually. On one occasion, I took about 40 upcoming African young leaders to Singapore when Lim Kuan Yew was still alive. And I said to him on one occasion, I said, look, Lee, I have an NGO, Africa Leadership Forum, and I want you to come and address us. He said, no, if I travel against time, I'm useless for the next 48 hours. Why don't you bring those young African leaders to Singapore? I said, bring 40 African leaders to Singapore. I haven't got the money to bring them. He said, we will pay. And I took 40 African leaders from all over Africa to Singapore. For 3 days, he was bringing those who work with him to talk to us. And my young African leaders were all anxious. They are not as nervous as you are. And they were all anxious to get the recipe, to get the magic. And at the end of it, he said, there's no magic. They asked him, he said, there's no magic. We did a few things right, and we continue to do them right. No magic. We did a few things right, and we continue to do them right. And I believe it is in the line of Professor Dercon's book. At the end of that meeting, I said to my young African brothers and sisters, the takeaway is, what is your country doing right? And if your country, if you know what is your country doing right, does your country continue to do it right or to do them right? And if your country is not doing anything right, can you get something that your country would do right and will continue to do right? Now, for us in Nigeria, Professor Dercon to talk about Africanization of poverty. And Aig and I believe Jaga and Fairco will join us. I talk of Nigerianization of poverty for Africa. Because if Nigeria gets it right, the chances that we will become a catalyst for the rest of Africa to get it right. And for as long as Nigeria does not get it right, most countries in Africa will not get it right. It is simple. We form 20 to 25% of the population of Africa. And if 25% get it right, it will be an inspiration for others to get it right. So why have we got it with all that God has endowed us with? Why have we not got it right? I think that's part of what Professor Dercon will be telling us. But I believe three most important things that we need to get it right, that we don't seem to have, apart from leadership, is some focal point, something that we can all hold on to, some what else can I call it? Some core issue, some objective. What is that national objective that we can, in a simple, short statement, and that we can all chorus as we go along? We don't seem to have that. We seem also not to take national development and growth and goals seriously, but individual development. And if we go for only individual development, we are doing ourselves the greatest disservice. Because at the end of the day, what matters is national development. If the national development is there, infrastructure, growth, and all that, security, then we all are sure of development within our national development. And earlier this morning when we were talking, I said here in Ikoyi, up till 1975, 75, there are no walls, no fences. We live, and no doors to your house, to your garden, to your gate. And you can go from anywhere to anywhere. The national security was reasonably what it should be. And as a result of that, the individual security was taken care of. Today, we compete. Your prison wall is higher than mine. And yet, we are still not secure. Because if you think you are secure in your house, you are not secure at the airport. You are not secure on the road. You are not secure even in the trains. So, what must we do? Another thing that before I leave that, is continuity. Aig-Imoukhuede just told us 3 periods in the history of this country since independence, things have looked rosy. And three times we have slide back. Now why? Lack of continuity, lack of a national focus, and of course, individualism rather than nationalism. Professor Dercon in his book states that some countries have made progress because the elite have collectively agreed to focus on economic development instead of their own selfish interests. I've underlined that. I ask myself the question, if this is something that we can do here in Nigeria, and I believe it is, but we need to know how and the best way of doing it? Can we come together and agree that we will not continue to do the same thing we have done or we have been doing and which has not served our interest? Can we get our priorities right and do what is best for our nation in the short, medium, and long run? This is what we will be looking at with the author of this book this morning. I encourage everyone here present today to listen to what other countries have done and how they have made progress in developing their economies. I am sure that there's much that we can learn from these lessons and apply to our own situation. We only have one Nigeria, and if we continue to allow it to fall apart around us, we have us to blame. But I will say again, and I think it's worth repeating, that there have been period in this country when we have had critical mass of people to put things right, whether politically or economically. We had G34 in the time of Abacha. They stuck their neck out. Men, elite in this country, and counted a military dictator. And they won the day. They won the day for themselves. They won the day for all of us. And we were all better for it. Can our elite have a common goal, what I call common unity of purpose, commonality of goal, that will bind us together with critical mass of our elite to get our country right and going right? Professor, you have the floor.
Is the microphone on?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, that sounds good. Yeah. I think I'm going to stand up. I think I can address you better. Sticker Chair, Your Excellency, thank you for the very kind introduction. Thank you for the foundation to host me. Are we okay? Yeah. Can I just check? There's a few slides that will come up. Can we maybe see where that works? And if it doesn't work, I will talk through it, so there's not a big worry about it. So people are beginning to introduce a little bit what I've been writing about. And I feel actually even more nervous than I actually was alluding to. Because, you know, who am I to tell you? Who am I to tell you? You know, I was born in Belgium. You know, what has Belgium to tell Africa? Very little. I hardly took the penny. I worked for the UK government, you know. There's history here, you know. I want to be very careful here in what I don't want to come and lecture you, but I want to begin with laying out some facts. And I'll do it like this. And I want to begin by laying out some facts. And I just want to check whether the slides are coming up indeed and whether that's working. But just describe a little bit of some of the phenomena that we've observed in the world. But then also begin to actually talk a little bit about, you know, what is it that some countries seem to have done, very different countries, but done in the last 30, 40 years to actually begin to take off and progress. And why is it that actually others seem to be staying behind?
So let me try to lay out the facts. And look, and if slides come, they come, but I can just describe. It's easy enough. You know, when we go back, say about 30 years, if we go back about 30 years to the early 1990s, and we ask ourselves, you know, what was the state of the world? Well, for me as a researcher, as the kind of things I've been doing, and looking, especially working in Africa, in fact, in that period, I just had reached Ethiopia, which had come out of terrible times, and actually was one of the poorest countries in the world. And, you know, when you start looking at the extent of extreme poverty, maybe you can go to the next slide straight away. If we then think of the level of extreme poverty, we had probably about 2 billion people in the world living in extreme poverty. You know, we can argue about definitions, and we can do this forever. But I use the definition that people like me as economists, as analysts, find reasonably acceptable. And where were these extreme poor people then? Well, it's actually probably about 1 billion in East Asia, of which about 800 million in China. There was probably about 600 million in South Asia, of which about 450 million probably in India. There were then probably about 400 million extreme poor people in sub-Saharan Africa. Now when we start looking what happened since then, if we look at what happened since then is that actually first in East Asia, where we now reach numbers that are maybe 50 million people, so going from about 1 billion to 50 million. We go then and we look around, for example, in South Asia, where after 2000, extreme poverty in South Asia began to decline as well, in countries like India, but also in Bangladesh, even in Nepal and places like that. And we see that these things are beginning to come down. And then we come to a kind of a situation where we are today, where 90% of the extreme poor people live in Africa. 90% of the extreme poor people live in sub-Saharan Africa, about 450 million. In fact, there are more extreme poor people now in sub-Saharan Africa than there were in 1990. Yes, population has gone up, and indeed, there has been progress. As a share of the population, it's fewer. But it is quite striking. Now, of course, that means we see differences. We see some countries in the world that have made progress. You know, and I will immediately say, and even if you think, you know, these include countries with colonial regimes that were not particularly benign. This includes countries with histories that were problematic. This includes countries that have oil and that seem to have made progress. But it actually is even worse for some countries, and dare I say, it's a little bit worse for you. Because if you then start looking inside Africa, and that's the story that's not very well told. We kind of say, oh, it's Africa. No, it isn't Africa. You know, Africa is not a country. And I always repeat that, and people like me get told that all the time. But when you start looking at the extreme poverty, sub-Saharan Africa is not one country. Because if you then start looking at the 23 countries that had more than 8 million people in 1990, and of which about a fifth was extreme poor or more. You know, Africa has a lot of very small countries, but 23 of any kind of size. If you then start looking at these countries, of course it includes Nigeria, it includes Ethiopia, it includes, of course, a lot of countries that had at that level, at that time, probably about a fifth of the population extreme poor. Now, if you start looking at these countries, and maybe we can go to the next slide, if we look at these countries, then we have countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have managed to reduce the level of extreme poverty by half. So you have, for example, Ghana, and you have Ethiopia, that actually reduced its extreme poverty, similar rates as we, for example, will have seen happening in Bangladesh. Oh, that's perfect. And so we do have countries that did it, but we also have countries, probably about 7 or 8 in sub-Saharan Africa, that have managed to double their extreme poverty. And which one comes on top? I think you know the answer. It is the Nigeriaization of poverty. Because actually, all projections that we can make, and there's lots of different researchers that do this, they will tell us that the country with the largest number of extreme poor people in 2030 will be Nigeria. It will lead the league tables in the world. With the number of extreme poor people, it will be Nigeria. Number 2 will be the DRC. Number 3 will be Madagascar. And then we can argue a bit which one is the next one. Maybe Malawi, maybe not. But it will be Nigeria. And that's actually, you know, so shocking given where you were and what is the potential of this place. But I do think, and people have alluded to it, this is not about, oh well, this is just the only solution that is pray to God and hope for something else. This is not destiny. Okay? Now, and maybe we can go to the next slide. Oh, I have controlling it myself, sorry. Yes, oops. Now I can't say it. Yeah. It translates itself, and you don't have to see it in great detail, when people online can probably see it better. It is not just about, oh, we didn't do well for the poor. It's about economics. It's about the economy. It's about GDP. In fact, if we look around the world of the places where extreme poverty went down, it was also the countries that grew a lot. Now, I want to be very careful. You know, I'm not a deep believer in trickle-down economics or whatever. That's not the point. It's just a point of countries that managed to get somehow to come together around growth, typically also did around development and poverty reduction. It's not about that you need, that growth will necessarily lead to poverty reduction, but actually they did it. And so you get, of course, on top there China, which of course massively reduced poverty from about 800 million to probably about 20 or 30 million. But you do get other countries. In fact, countries that for some reason or another look remarkably similar to Nigeria. Indonesia. It had oil. It has a lot of tensions with diversity in the country, different islands. It was actually poorer than Nigeria in 1960. It came out of a terrible conflictual 1960s, with conflict coming out of also a time of independence, of a lot of violence as well. It came out of looking for its political model and military regimes and democracy and all these things not working very well together for a while. It had a lot of things together. Indonesia is a country that has grown now in the last 50 years at 3.5% per year, consistently, except for 4 years around the Asia crisis in '97. So it had a little bit of a blip, it's the green line on my curve, and then it managed to catch up again. It's a country that actually has managed to do something there. So there's something there to worthwhile keeping in mind. Now there's other countries as well. You know, Ethiopia grew well in the last decade until 2020, and of course it's extremely sad what is happening there and the conflictual things, and we're very hopeful also for our chair for his efforts in that conflict, because there's a lot to lose there, because they actually made a lot of progress. There's places like Ghana managed since the 1990s get back to growth. There's also places like the DRC that actually is now, arguably it's done far worse than Nigeria. Its GDP per capita is now a third of what it was in 1970. Okay, it's a bit better than 10 years ago when it was a quarter of what it was in 1970. So it's a bit beginning to recover, but it's there. But anyway, there are these different countries, and Vietnam was mentioned earlier, India was mentioned, Bangladesh. You know, Bangladesh. Anyone here, and I see many of people are old enough like me to remember that we had no hope for Bangladesh. In fact, my very first essay in development economics was the quote, the famous quote by Henry Kissinger, "Is Bangladesh a basket case?" And I said, yes, absolutely. There was no way it could get there. It was massive population growth, it had massive disease thing, climate change happening there already in the 1970s all the time. There was no future for this. This is a country that has actually grown consistently for the last 20 years at 5–6% per year. It actually is really exporting garments. It had nothing in industry by 1970. It's actually now the leading garment exporter in the world. And actually it reduced poverty, especially for girls, in a dramatic sort of way. Education, health indicators, it's quite a remarkable thing. Now, the point about these countries like Indonesia, Bangladesh, or maybe even Ghana or Ethiopia, it's not about miracles here. But they are very different. You know, they're totally different from China. And that's the important thing. Okay, so what is it then that explains this? And let me briefly mention here, because the chair already mentioned this idea of, you know, what is it that these countries that are successful have in common? Let me very briefly recount a bit of an anecdote, but you may well recognize bits in it as well. So I was, about 7, 8 years ago, in my function as a chief economist, was invited by the Prime Minister in Congo, in DRC, to go and talk with their team about the National Development Plan. Similarly, a few weeks later, I was invited in Ethiopia to do the same thing with the government there. I went to DRC and I saw a room full of very smartly dressed people, nice, very good suits, everything, about 20 young people actually, and they gave me the best development plan I've ever heard in the world. That was really good. Each of them said in each sector, in health, in education, infrastructure, in macroeconomic stability, business development, you name it, they had a really good plan. And we listened there for 3 hours to them. And I remember walking out, and one of my colleagues, a Congolese colleague, he said to me, "Quel spectacle, what a show we've just seen." Because nothing will ever happen. Nothing will ever happen. So they have this perfect development plan. And why would he say it? Well, partly actually because we had the day before been in the National Ministry of Budget. And they were very excited because Parliament was going to approve the budget next week. Say, okay, that's really great. Which month of the fiscal year are you? Oh, no, we already reached month 11 of the fiscal year, but the budget hasn't been approved. But it will be the first time in 5 years that the budget will be approved before the end of the fiscal year. Okay, so there's nothing going to come. There's zero implementation that happens anywhere. And we actually have no trust in it. We go to Ethiopia, and we talk there with the governor of the central bank, with finance minister, very able technocrats, extremely able advisors. They tell us their development plan. And we were there together with other experts from other worlds. We had actually Justin Lin from China. We had an expert from the US there as well. We had actually some great people there. We were listening to them very carefully. And we all thought, this is not quite perfect. There's all kinds of issues. There's a issue of macroeconomic stability here. Not sure it's going to work. But we all walked out of the room and thinking, wow, they're going to do this. And you know what? They may well be successful. And Ethiopia became the fastest growing economy in the period 2010-2019. Now, it's a really important thing, and it comes back to a bit what Lee Kuan Yew said to you. Actually, in the end, the recipe wasn't perfect. The recipe, in each of these countries we look at it, they make errors, they make things and whatever. The ingredients were right, okay? But the recipe wasn't. And I think to get progress, it's not the issue of being lectured exactly about what to do and the exact small detail, the blueprint that needs to be designed. Actually, the experience tells us that quite a lot of different things, different strategies can actually get you progress. So it's not in the detail. Okay, I need to qualify this a little bit. There's probably 3 things you need to keep in mind. And I'll come then to the main point of what I want to bring home to you. 3 things to keep in mind. First of all, of course, history will matter. You know, and I will get questions on the floor. And if someone will ask me about colonialism, of course it matters. You know, I'm no fool. Structures, history, boundaries, the way countries are set together, these things matter. There's a great historian, economic historian from neighboring Benin, Léonard Wanchekon, who is actually in Princeton. He's the most successful academic from Benin, probably, or from Benin in the world, and he teaches at Princeton. And he basically says, if you look around Africa, it's about 50% history. If we look about performance, history matters, you know. Natural resources don't make it easier to govern your country well, because it's pretty easy to actually, not to do much as a policymaker and still line your pockets, okay? So these are constraining factors to get good policymaking. We should not be fools and imagine that it's easy. Structures, history matters. But 50%, he says. What else is it then? Well, the other 50%, it basically says, is, you know, sensible policies. You know, this is where economics comes into it. Economics although we love to do it as academics, say exactly what the first best would be, the perfect solution to everything, the perfect thing. Actually, the best use of economics is usually to call out the silly and stupid things, okay? And in fact, the most important role of economics is saying, and you see that sometimes in markets, when really things get out of hand, the markets will respond, you know? And that's basically the way to think about economics. It stops you it tells you that there are trade-offs, that you can't do imaginary things. You can't, you can't just gamble on, that commodity prices, oil prices will keep on doing something, hope over reason, that they will always be high. At some point it will come home to roost. You can't just do these kind of things. That's what economics does. It constrains you because they're sensible things. But where is it then? If there's no particular recipe here, if there's no particular recipe, it becomes about actions and behavior. And what Léonard Wanchocon tells us, it's agency, it's the actions of the actors that can make a difference. It's how they act and behave that will determine your destiny of where you're going. Actions and behavior. Okay, it's politics, but not just politics, that it's only the commander-in-chief that should be blamed for everything. Politics is more, and this is where I come to the kind of underlying thesis of my book. Most countries in the world, and Nigeria will be definitely part of it, there is an influential group of people with power and influence, and they are not just the people who sit in the villa, and they're not just only them. They are basically, okay, the politicians will matter. They're also the top civil servants, which I hopefully will have a good engagement with in 2 days. They also are the business elite, the people in the business community, because they are all the time interacting with these groups as well. And they're there, they're acting, they're behaving. They probably are the public intellectuals as well, because they tell the stories, the narratives. And some of these are better, and some of these are just imaginary stories. They are maybe even also civil society who puts the pressure in the right way and focuses on the right things. They actually are the elite. I call this the elite. And okay, this is where I'm a bit scared, because I know somehow or another, whether you like it or not, I am part of it, you are part of it. Okay? You are part of it, and it's the actions and behaviors of the elite in a country that will, in the end, drive whether it's progress or not. Because that's fundamentally the thesis of my book. You can have lots of different actions and behaviors. For example, you could find it totally acceptable that the state is built up as a way of rewarding those who support you. That the actions of the state are those that need to reward you, who keep you in power. You could have that. You could have a clientelist state. You could go further, like Mobutu Sese Seko had in Congo, where basically the purpose of the state is to steal from the people and distribute it to a small group of people. Mobutu Sese Seko had he had a good way with words. And if you read French, it's actually quite interesting at times. For example, he addressed his civil servants at some point. And his civil servants, he said, look, I hear on the street that you steal from people. You know what, he said to his civil servants, I understand, but if you have to steal, could you please steal a little and leave something for the next one as well? Okay, you could run a state like that. I'm not saying that this is Nigeria. I really don't want to say this at all. But there is somehow that the thing that we don't seem to be getting in many states is somehow that coming together, that the actions and behaviors are driven by another objective. And that they don't look at what you do in a country as a zero-sum game. Basically, if I get something, then I can make sure someone else doesn't get it. Basically, run an economy as a zero-sum game. If you run an economy as a zero-sum game, you will not have growth, because the pie will not increase. That's called distributive politics, where basically whoever controls the state will make sure that they will gain from it, and those who don't control, they don't get anything. And so basically that's zero-sum politics, distributive politics. You basically have, and what have done the countries, as diverse as they are, from China to Bangladesh to Indonesia to Ghana since the 1990s, with all its imperfections, to Ethiopia between 2003 and 2020, what do they have in common? That fundamentally, those with power and influences committed to actually make growth and development central to their platform. And seriously, not just at the DRC writing beautiful plans and then having another game in town. Because what is the game in town in Kinshasa? Well, it's all about controlling the natural resource contracts. That's the only game in town. You know, it's a bit like you spend your politics 10 minutes a day running your country, and then the other 23 hours and 50 minutes to making sure you line your pockets for those who need, these pockets need to be lined. You can't just talk as if you do it. In fact, the Prime Minister involved, he's now charged with corruption in the Congo. That is basically the way it is. You know, it's basically you make that a central platform. And if you then go and look carefully, what have we to learn from China? You know, very, very little. China is such a different state than yours. China has 2,000 years of centralized taxation, and pretty effective as well. 2,000 years. 2,000 years of a meritocratic bureaucracy. In fact, 2,000 years of a centralized state that functions well. You know, if your state is built like that, and you are a Deng Xiaoping, and you basically say, my God, running the economy purely on ideology, as they had been doing under Mao, and coming out of so much conflict when after the death of Mao, well, the Cultural Revolution, the death of Mao, the Gang of Four, and in the 1970s in China, as some of you will follow. And you reach 1979, and you say, look, we are going to lose power as the Communist Party of China. We're going to lose power. We better dump ideology. We need to be pragmatic. But if I then want to be pragmatic and say I need legitimacy from the population through growth and development, yeah, look, if you're in China, I can see that you'll use the state as the instrument of development, because you have a state that actually has a record of being able to do this. So if any state in the world that could ever do it is probably the kind of China state and some of these East Asian states that have very similar characteristics. So you can see that they can do it. And you understand that. They do it. But you can't go to, say, Malawi, where the state since independence entirely is built up by giving jobs to the boys and the girls, mainly the boys. And basically, it's simply a vehicle for it's my time to eat whenever you have power, and basically you give to your friends the kind of support. If you have a state like that, there's just no way that you will ever be able to do development through that. Bangladesh understood that. Bangladesh, after its independence war, it had built up a state essentially as I just described. In the 1980s, they clearly started recognizing, oh my God, this is going totally wrong. Everybody says we're a basket case. We better actually do something else. And in fact, interestingly, the state started withdrawing. And actually from the economy, even from social sectors, it allowed NGOs to come in a way that is unprecedented in the world. The largest NGO in the world is a Bangladeshi NGO called BRAC. It's the largest NGO in the world. It did a huge amount of the social sector provision. But it was not by fighting the state recognized we couldn't do it. We create a space. You know, think of a country that would allow an NGO to become bigger than the state in a sector. Bangladesh did it. India would never have allowed it. Most countries in the world would have not allowed it. That's actually a smart thing. And that basically, I want to then come to the three things that you will be able to recognize that we're moving to an underlying commitment to growth and development in the elite. I call this a development bargain. And what are the three things that you would see in a development bargain in a country? And so the three things are, first of all, it's something to do with politics. It's something, what you were alluding to, is that actually a credible politics where there's actually an idea of some kind of rules of the game, that, you know, that the politics can be a form of continuity, that it's credible, that, you know, getting power is not like, oh, let's now disrupt everything and change everything, but actually sensibly saying, look, we're building on some longer-term vision here. If you look in Bangladesh, they had the change of power. In fact, even in Ghana, they kept on changing prime minister and presidents. They were kicked out. There is a continuity in the last 25 years in the nature of the way. A bit ups and downs and a bit of difference, but there is a continuity. There are rules of the game somehow restricting. I call this credible politics for peace and stability. Because without this peace and stability, you're not going to get this long-term growth. So there is something there. And this is not about, oh, you need an autocrat or a democrat. You know, Ghana works as democracy. Malawi is a democracy. It doesn't deliver anything. Growth in Malawi has been 1.5% per year since the 1960s. That's nothing, okay? There's no real per capita growth in Malawi. So it's not about democracy, it's how you use your system. This is not a plea, we need to have an autocrat or democratic state. No, you need a political system that functions for your place, that actually creates something. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The second thing is the way the state functions. You need a state that is self-aware that it can do. This is not about, oh, we need state-led development, or we need market-led development. You know, there's no state in the world that actually is developed with a pure version of either of these. It's actually a self-aware state that understands how its own state functions and what it has built up. If your state is not really built up at a local or national level based on meritocracy, you don't expect that to be a really effective instrument of delivery. And actually recognize that and just be a bit careful and create some space for other actors. You know, if you are a state like China, yeah, maybe you can deliver via the state. Is that self-awareness is key. And then I come to the last point that is crucial. And that is something that actually often goes wrong in many places. We can have beautiful plans. But as our distinguished chair was saying, we have no continuity. How do you get continuity? Continuity you're not going to get by blindly keep on following the same line of direction, because all these countries have made mistakes. You know, most fascinating discussions I had in China with people that were involved with Deng Xiaoping, where someone was asked the question, did anything ever fail? And the big advisor, he was involved in the early designs in the early 80s and says, oh yes, we tried 4 special economic zones and 3 of them failed. You know, admitting to failure it needs to happen. That's a really hard one. So you can't blindly be ideological. And this is what I call just a learning culture. And this is where accountability comes into. Every country that has been successful had a form of accountability, because learning and accountability go together. Accountability in China, because you had such a strong state, it was entirely internally in the party. If you didn't deliver on your progress, you were out, and you were out, whether you were a princeling, a link to the previous founding fathers of the Communist Party or not, you were out. If you didn't deliver, you were out. Let me be honest, I don't know a state in Africa where this could function. This is not the way the state is built up. This is why you need other forms of accountability systems. This is where you need, for example, in Ghana, democracy to function well. I was in Kenya yesterday, why actually we see signs that after constitutional reform, more people are being elected based on outcomes than simply because they're from a particular ethnic group. And so you begin to get external accountability to form. So, I need to end here, and I just want to end here with just a couple of the final things, and I want to refer to back to it, you know. Leadership matters here, okay? But leadership not in the commander-of-chief sense only.
No.
It's in the coalition former of chiefs. You know, Lee Kuan Yew was very effective in building a great team and a very great coalition around him.
Yeah.
You know, this was not alone in Singapore. It's not simply that, but it's also to be the communicator-in-chief, because it's really hard to actually keep that narrative, that national narrative together. And so, this is also where I would appeal to you. You know, there is a famous song from the 1970s with the title that you may well recognize, "The Revolution Won't Be Televised." I can tell you that the elite bargain will not be televised. This will not somehow a moment that will happen and you can sit back and you will be just watching it from a distance happening. You know, it will only happen if people start acting in their behaviors and their actions to actually forge this kind of consensus. Because it's only when people like you start believing that others will act like this, that actually that change will happen. You have to begin to believe that others will also act like that. And that is what it makes it so hard. And that's actually where it lies for the future. Okay, thank you very much.
it working? Is it okay? Okay, thank you.
Just turn it on.
I think yours is
Right, good afternoon. Okay, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. We have a few minutes before we get question and answers, and the way this has been formatted is that Professor Jega and myself will interrogate some of what he has said first, so we have a better understanding, and then we now ask for question and answers. But please, if you do have any questions now, you can write it down on a piece of paper, pass it on to the MC, and then we can also take it on as we go. So let me start with you, Professor Dercon. Thank you so much for this wonderful book. And I think, as you said in your book, this is a contribution to the development discussion. And it will help us, as we all here in this room, but I would say actually the whole of Nigeria, are thinking through how do we move forward. Because I think there is consensus about that. How do we move forward? Now, the first question I'd like to ask you is, you talk about a development bargain. I'm not sure why you use the word bargain. So could you explain that? And then the second, in talking about the elite, when I was speaking, he said this is the elite. Is this the elite you have in mind? What elite do you have in mind? 2 questions. Thank you.
So I'll take this. So, okay, so these are very good questions, of course. So why do I call it a bargain? Because, you know, in many ways, I understand that everybody has also their personal interest. And that they actually are uncomfortable sometimes to act because you don't really know whether others will be acting as well. And if we work for collective good things, is this what we often call collective action problem, you know? How do we actually act together in the same sort of way? And that actually involves going away from this kind of outcome, which is the comfortable one, which is the status quo, which is a kind of a form of a, call it an equilibrium, something that doesn't easily shift. You know, first of all, the status quo, because we can rage about the rest, but actually we know we understand it entirely. It is a matter of actually getting some sense of an underlying set of shared expectations and objectives. So you basically, why do you call it a bargain? Because we are expecting others also to act in certain ways for it to be sensible. Because, you know, if you spent your career in recent times on tax things, you know, there's more we know in countries that it becomes more likely that everybody pays their taxes if they believe everybody else will pay their taxes as well. And so that's the kind of the idea that you actually make a tacit bargain, an understanding between each other that you do. And it can be, and it's a little bit, this is because it can actually be not necessarily comfortable. It's uncertain a little bit as well. So, and I want to answer your other part, you know, who is the elite, is that, well, you know, it's always fluid and it changes. But one of the things, though, is it that, you know, when I was in Bangladesh talking about this, people were very clear in saying, okay, the core of the elite is 50 families. And these are the 50 families that determine anything. I was just in Mauritius. And people say, okay, there's 5 families in commerce, 5 families in traditional, the economy and the sugar, and 5 families in politics. And then around it, you have the people that are connected to it. Now, I talk about the elite because, not because I believe that everything should be based around of the elite, that ordinary people shouldn't have a role, but actually they tend to have blocking power. So I kind of look at this group of people who has enough power to actually both shift but also block. This is actually maybe finally, because I was maybe not clear, why do I call it a gamble? The elite understands very well that the status quo is comfortable. Rocking the boat is actually risky. Any country that embarked on this idea of growth and development has to recognize that new elites will emerge as well. And this is, for example, the story in Indonesia, that a whole new elite in the economy emerged that was based on totally different sectors than originally, that actually emerged and possibly in the end ended up the end of the resulted in the end of the commander-in-chief in that position of power. So, yeah, so can't name them, I can't be exact about it, but it's more the kind of group that has power and influence with enough blocking power that if they don't move, very little will move.
What I will add to that, Ferko, is this is a true story. A senior civil servant said to me after the time of Murtala and Obasanjo, he said, if we civil servants can survive Murtala and Obasanjo regime, we can survive anybody. They are elite, and they can do and undo. They are part and parcel of the elite group. And the point that he has made, that they can make to happen, and they can make to not to happen, is the point that makes from elite. And if you like, you can actually divide the society broadly into three. The leadership out there, the elite, and then the downtrodden. But if the elite do not allow to happen, nothing will happen.
Thank you. Professor Jega, and then I'll come back.
Well, first of all, I would like to express my appreciation to the Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation for giving me this wonderful opportunity to participate in this conversation. And I was able to read the book, and I must commend and congratulate Professor Dercon for a very insightful, very qualitative, critical analysis of the issues of development globally, but in particular in the countries which he has used in the study for illustration. What is clear, as he pointed out, is that some countries have developed while others have not, and that this needs to be explained as to why. And he's offered a very beautiful, cogent analysis of what, in his view, is responsible for this. And I think central to that, his argument, theoretical postulation, is the necessity of elite bargain, or what he calls development bargain. I think, following my colleague's question, sometimes you use elite bargain and development bargain interchangeably. Is elite bargain a subset, or is it one and the same thing? I think we need to get that conceptual clarification. But it's very, very clear, and it's a compelling argument, that the elite have to agree as to what is the direction of development rather than pay attention to self-serving objectives. And I think the question to ask then, given the experiences that you have studied, how is this elite bargain constructed? You know, is there a process? You know, who should be the drivers of this, apart from the difficulty of the definition of elite, which you pointed out to, but you can agree, you know, these are the categories of elite, and we want to drive an elite bargain or a development bargain. So how has this happened in other countries? So that countries like Nigeria that are clearly falling behind, if we have to pursue that trajectory of development, then how do we begin to go about it, learning from other experiences? You've made the point, I think very, very well said, that what people should be looking for is adaptation, not adoption. There is no model that you can just take and adopt to your own circumstances. You have to look at the experiences, but you have to adapt it to your own local context. You know, so but still, how have others done it? So that if we want to go on that trajectory, we will then from the experiences of others and pursue it. Secondly, as a broad context discussion, we know that we evaluate the trajectory of development theoretical postulations from, say, the 1950s to the 60s and until recently. We had initially people like Ross who were talking about stages of economic growth. And countries like ours in Africa would need to catch up through modernization, industrialization, and growth-oriented development strategy. Then, of course, subsequently, in the 70s and the 80s, the emphasis shifted from growth-oriented to what was called growth with equity. Measures of this are very clear. If you are pursuing growth-oriented development strategy, then the measures of growth are the GDP per capita or GMP per capita. Whereas, if you are talking about growth with equity, then obviously the measures are different. And that's where the issues of physical quality of life comes in as a measure, and then subsequently the Human Development Index introduced by the UNDP, or the United Nations more generally. Now, in your presentation here today, you indicated that you are not just pushing for the classical trickle down, which is growth and development will take care of itself. You know, but I think it will be nice if you can further articulate how does your theoretical postulation relate with this body of theoretical postulations which exist. You know, because I wonder, for example, yes, many countries have addressed poverty, but does addressing poverty, that is lifting people from spending $1.90 a day to maybe $3 or even $2, you can say they have been lifted up. But how does it translate in terms of the inequality and the gap that exists within societies? I think I will begin with this and come back to others later. Thank you.
Okay. So let me try to be concise. First on the first point you made about, and just a clarification to make sure. You know, when we postulate, when we talk about an elite bargain, I think, you know, there is an elite bargain of sorts in this country. You have virtually every society somehow or another that is not totally imploded into violence, has a form of an underlying elite bargain, and then make a subset of it an elite bargain that has development and growth as an essential feature. So, for example, if I take India, you could argue that it had an elite bargain of sorts all the way from independence, Nehruvian politics, and so on. But somehow it didn't, until the early 1990s, manage to translate that elite bargain in actually a development bargain where actually there was progress in growth and also in development indicators at scale. So somehow, in your language, a development bargain is a subset of all the possible elite bargains that you can have in a society. The opposite against it is that basically you could have a totally fragmented elite. I don't think that is necessarily the case, although of course all societies have elements of fragmentation. But if I go to South Sudan, that's a fragmented elite. That's conflict. Afghanistan is a totally fragmented elite, and that's conflict. Okay, so that's a bit. The key thing, of course, is that how did countries get there? And of course, that's for me, it's the hardest question. It's the fairest criticism that when I try to describe the commonality, I can't very easily tell you these are the three things exactly that they all did, because They had to find within their own society, within their own history, within their own cultural determinants in the structure of their economy, a way of actually getting it to come together. I described it for China, where it was actually survival of the Communist Party. It was pure survival for the state. And actually, they chose pragmatism over ideology, you know. It doesn't matter whether the cat is white or black as long as it catches mice, which was a huge change for that country, because until then, it had to be all about the ideology, the Marxist ideology had to be central. That was a huge step, but it came purely out of a quest for survival. If I'm willing to, you know, to suggest, say, for a country like Ethiopia, you know, its history was troubled, and this whole idea of the different cohabitation of the different nations has historically been difficult. Some economic historians tell us that peaceful transitions of power in Ethiopia have probably happened only about 2 or 3 times since the 18th century in Ethiopia. That's a very divided society, and of course the conflict is that as well. But when Meles Zenawi somehow forged an elite bargain between different groups around in the beginning after 2000, it was all around also, you know, he represented a small group of people in the country, and actually to get somehow legitimacy through the economy as well. I think in Ghana, I would say the elite bargain came after the military regime with the constitution, which, by the way, the constitution is imperfect because it bans you to set up a party that actually is single region oriented or single ethnic oriented. So there's constraints built in the constitution. But the political class was willing to buy into it, and you get peaceful transition. So their political stability was key. I would say that's the same what's happening in things. So they look for ways of around, and that's again always about the 3 things that they look for ways to overcome it. So the first thing is, what do we need to get credible politics for the longer term in place in our own society? And find an answer to that. The second thing is, and it comes back to it, and it's important here as well, not trying to use the state for things that the state can't do. Be self-aware, being aware of the limitations of the state, and not look at the state as the instrument for everything. And the third thing is about the learning and the accountability, finding the learning mechanism to keep your first point of continuity in track, because it shouldn't be blind continuity, it should be continuity of learning. And find the solutions around it in each society is where it then comes down to it. And then the final thing on growth, and it's really glad you pick it up, because, you know, I don't believe, and I want to repeat it again, it's not about growth alone. But what is actually quite interesting in the evolution of thought, these days as economists we would say, no country can sustainably grow unless it keeps an eye on inequality and on basically delivering of basic service for its people. There is no country that has been able to sustain the growth in doing. Even the IMF these days, you know that actually recently the IMF warned the UK that its budget would increase inequality and that would be bad for growth. That's actually where it comes into it. So it's not about an ideological choice of what comes first or what comes next. But actually it's about, if you want that continuity of growth, these societies that have been successful have learned that they need to keep an eye on these things as well, that they keep distribution there as well. So that's an important thing, and it becomes part of that pragmatism of keeping growth on the road, that you need to have this. It's not an ideological thing, it has to be equity first or growth first. You actually just have to do the 2 of them because they will come together, otherwise it won't work.
So thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof. So let me just summarize what you've just said in response to Professor Jega. And that is, how do we build the elite bargain? It's different for each country. And you've given examples for China, for Ghana. And so as we are here talking about Nigeria, I think your message to us is we need to think through how to build that elite bargain. Now, a few questions have come in. I have a couple of mine, but let me start with one of the questions and I'll come to mine. And this is, what role does education or miseducation of the youth population play in driving growth and ensuring generational continuity. So that's one. Two, this refers to you as a Belgian. And I also saw that actually you devoted quite a lot of time to DRC, perhaps because, again, that's a country you know very well. Actually, a question I had was very little on, nothing at all on Francophone West Africa. In fact, outside of DRC, a lot of it was on other countries that had colonial power. So it would be nice to know why. But the question here is colonialism, I know you said history was one of the things that matters. So a question here, is colonialism responsible for our wars in Africa? Well, maybe I should also rephrase that question. I'm saying it exactly as it was said, but perhaps I'll also rephrase it to say, even if it was, or if it isn't, how do we build that consensus with our diversity, with our different opinions, with our different views, both here in Nigeria, outside Nigeria? We're very vocal people. How do we build that elite consensus? I know you said we have to think through it ourselves, but it would be nice to know from your perspective, how do we do that? And let me give you one more. I hope it's not too much. Yes. Okay. Nigeria is not doing well in the financialization of its state-owned assets. And I think this talks to what should the state do or the state not do. From your study, how critical is it for Nigeria to leverage its capital market to list its assets to achieve accountability and shared prosperity? Over to you.
Okay, right. So it's a really good point on education, okay? So obviously education matters, okay? And it comes back actually maybe to the answer I was just giving earlier. There's no country that can ever sustain growth without also keep on investing in its broader population and its health of its population. So it comes together, it's symbiotic. It's not about what I don't say, and that's unfortunate, we have to admit to that, Education in itself doesn't necessarily change societies. We have examples of societies where education has changed societies. We have examples of societies where despite education, societies don't seem to be changing, and where you have frustrated youth that don't feel their aspirations met, and so on. It's the same in political systems. There was a long time people said, as long as we invest in education, everybody will want democracy. China has a highly educated population. It doesn't necessarily follow this. But so I see it more as, it comes back to this whole statement of we have no particular recipe for keeping this growth and development going. But the ingredients are there. And you need to do this one thing. There's no silver bullet here. There's no one recipe to build this cake. Education will play its role. And actually maybe look at it in a slightly different way. Massive amounts in every country in the world, including Nigeria, are spent on education. But actually, a lot of the malaise that you have, the problems you have in all over the function of the state in lots of countries in the world, also applies to education. Despite the money, education doesn't necessarily deliver learning. So it becomes part of that same malaise, that same kind of problem that we have. So you need to think more, not what should come first, education or not. It's one of the ingredients, but then try to see whether you can do it better. Because part of that kind of consensus is to also a deep commitment in the state to be self-aware. What does it do well? Where does it learn? Where does it hold to account? And I think an obvious thing is actually if children don't learn in school, that's a failure of accountability in the system. That's not a failure of the parents or the children. It's a failure of the system that is doing it. So it matters. The DRC thing, the Francophone countries, I'm actually really pleased that you asked, because I'm actually, I actually left the UK now a couple of weeks ago to literally spend about 3 months mainly in Francophone African countries. And I'm actually going to spend, so I was in Mauritius, I'll go to Senegal soon, I'll be in Niger as well, and I want to learn from these places as well, because it is a weakness of the kind of division of the continents. I don't think, from what I learned, is that there are fundamental differences. There are success stories in Francophone Africa. There's also failures as well. So it's there as well. And then on colonialism, okay? So the point is somehow that it is a constraining factor. And in a country like the DRC, you know, when Léonard Wanchekon, the historian that I was quoting from Benin, when he says 50% is history, I would say 60% in the case of the Congo. You know, it is more. You know, there's some countries more constrained by their history. They're more constrained by the very unequal division of where the natural resources are in the country, and so on and so on. So you have this. But the problem is that I have with, and you know, I will not say it's not an issue, but there are countries with a terrible colonial history, and I think of Indonesia, that actually managed to get away from it and get over it. And so somehow it becomes back to the agency that is important. So, I think on the final question, I may be missing one, and you may want to later on come back to it. I didn't write it down well, but the final question is about finance and capital markets and so on. I thought was really interesting, the question, is that, you know, one of the great things, well, one of the weaknesses of finance in general, whether it's financing governments or other things, is that in itself isn't guaranteeing good implementation and good use, okay? Finance itself doesn't guarantee that resources are used well. And you know, it's to work in government. And government, the way it seems to work is always you see a problem, you do a lot of problem identification, and the solution is to allocate a budget to it. There is a middle thing there. Look, how the hell are we going to try to solve the problem? And most of the time, budgets get allocated to problems, not to actually somehow thinking to solutions. And finance can have that element. But there was a great term there. Finance can create accountability. Finance is a key part, because that's something you can check and follow through, whether the finance is linked to an outcome. And I think, I will not go deeper into this, a much more complicated technical question that was asked. But that's the way you should think about, whether it's in government or also in other sectors. It's actually, you know, and including in tax and so on, it is the key part of it to actually getting the accountability. Am I missing a question?
There is, but maybe I'll ask the chair to answer that, because perhaps it's an unfair question of how do we build an elite consensus in Nigeria? And in doing that, Chair, I'll give you the mic, Chair, Your Excellency. It's also looking at what you feel has worked in the past, because when I was speaking, it talked about 2 periods of time when we pulled together. Was there something we can learn from that period in terms of a consensus that may have been built? And how can we leverage on that? Chair.
Thank you. I don't know, Aig, how much more time do we have? Because, yeah. Okay, all right.
Good question.
Thank you very much for being so kind. I had thought that Professor Dercon will attempt, when Atahiru Jaga asked the question, that you will want, well, and I must congratulate you for not trying to do it, that you will attempt to go into how to forge the elite consensus in a multinational society like Nigeria. And that is the question you are asking.
Yes.
And that is the question that we all have to ask ourselves. And I believe that the first thing first, we must have what I call unity of purpose. We will not all sleep and put our heads on the same pillow, but we must have minimum on which we all agree. And I think that is very, very important. The second is this issue of identity. And it goes along with the second, with the first. Do I see myself as a Nigerian? In the same way that Jaga will see himself as a Nigerian? Or do I see myself as a Yoruba man? In the same way that Jaga will see himself as a Fulani man? Now that is very, very important, because if we are going to talk of elite in a way that we will all be speaking the same language as far as development is concerned, we must have a few things in common. Now, not that we should agree on everything, and Professor Dercon made this clear. Not ideology, but development. Not ideology, but development. We must be clear. And development doesn't just happen. It has to be made to happen. I think that is the other point you are asking.
Yes.
Development just doesn't happen. So the 3 times that Aig-Imoukhuede mentioned that we have moved forward, and those 3 times the movement forward was made to happen. Soon after independence, until about 1965, or what you say, our leaders at independence were imbued with some inspiration.
Yeah,
we can do it better. I asked a few of our leaders what goaded them on. And they said, well, look, we felt that if the colonial powers can do it, we can do it as well as they can do it, if not better. Now, that is something that goaded them on, and it achieved result. Without being immodest, the time that the other 2 times coincided, as Aig-Imoukhuede said it, coincided with the time, or part of the time, that I was in government. But it didn't just happen. It was not just a coincidence. It was made to coincide. It was made to coincide. And that is it. And you have to make it to happen. The good thing, and I say that again with all sense of respect for what we have in this country. The good thing is that it can be made to happen. That is the good thing. It can be made to happen. The bad thing is that it can also be unmade. And what has happened in the past is that we have gone forward and we have gone back. Now, the question will be, how do we maintain consistency and continuity? And that is very, very important. How do we maintain consistency and continuity? And maybe that will be for another time, or maybe in winding up, Professor Dercon can give us the recipe for maintaining consistency and continuity. But that is very, very important. And I think that would have covered your question. Now, Atayoro, maybe you have
Thank you, Chairman, Your Excellency. I know time is well spent, and we still have to allow others to comment or ask questions. But I just want to ask two quick questions very briefly. There is now talk about Africa rising. How do you view that in the context of your studies? Secondly, you suggested in the book, and I think you also mentioned it here, that although people are saying we have a lot to learn from China on the role of the state, you think that that is not significant, if I may put it that way. But I think the role of the state, traditional role of the state with regards to regulation, with regards to enforcement, with regards to addressing basic and fundamental needs of the people in the context of growth is very, very important. And if you look at the Chinese state, those issues that they have built over thousands of years, the issue of meritocracy, the issue of competitive development of a public civil service, you know, I think those are things definitely we can learn from, and I want to hear your perspective, because in the context of African countries, not just talking about the historical issue relating to colonialism, but presently, many people are talking about the decomposition of the state. So unless you address the recomposition of the state and its capacity to discharge its traditional role, no matter what elite bargain you have, you cannot drive growth and development. So I think there are lessons, I suspect, and I don't know what you want to say about that. But I want to end, it's very interesting. You raised what Deng Xiaoping said about it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. But more recently, in reference to Nigeria, I came across an African saying which seems to illustrate some of the things you said about Nigeria. And I think we need to read what he said about Nigeria. It definitely, in the most beautiful way, summarizes all the things we agonize over. And I think it's on page 265 of your book or so. You know, so that saying is that, you know, a wise cat that thinks about tomorrow does not eat pregnant mice. And in Nigeria, I think what we have is that all our fat cats are busy catching mice, pregnant and none, and it probably contributes to the current predicament that we are in. So thank you very much. I will stop here because others need to engage.
Okay, that's wonderful. That's excellent. Thank you. Right. Look, that's a wonderful thing. So a little bit on the Africa Rising narrative, okay? So forgive me if I sound unkind, but it's a bit like, you know, Africa Rising was a little bit like cooking a souffle. I don't know whether any of you have ever tried it. Sometimes it rises and stays up, but sometimes it goes flat. And I'm afraid in quite a lot of countries it's gone flat because it didn't really have the ingredient in it to sustain that rising. And so you know, the Africa Rising, when you look at it in the data, unfortunately it followed too closely the commodity prices. It didn't get into the sustainable process of it. But it doesn't mean that the underlying idea, I mean, if I, you know, allow me to be optimistic here as well. In 30 years, we will probably talk in presentations like this about a large number of African states that will have risen. You know, when we think of colonialism, my view is also a little bit like you probably lost 20, 25 years of development, which East Asia and Asian countries didn't have. But then, you know, it will be the time of some of the countries. It's just that I hope Nigeria will be part of it, because Nigeria has that potential, because this is the period of it. In terms of learning from others, you know, I think what our chair was mentioning about what to learn and what we should think about, that's actually what we can learn from China. You know, what you were describing, that's actually also what a country that's successful like China was, which was actually building a unity of purpose amongst the key people. Which is basically, and this is interesting, and you know, the term unity of purpose is right. I told you it can't be words only, but the purpose has to be there. And what's really interesting, why is it in each country different? Because it will have to be a story about, yes, we agree it has to be about growth and development, but it has to be told in a national narrative, in its own national narrative. You know, I wasn't going to dwell too much on me being Belgian. You know, we're a very small place. But you know, we have 7 governments in our country because we couldn't solve our own ethnic issues unless we found a way to deal with it. We have 7 governments, 3 regions with its own government, 3 communities in its own government, and a central government. That's expensive. You know, the elite bargain here will always be somehow more expensive than a Chinese one because, you know, there will be national identities but also other identities, and you have to accommodate that. But there has to be the unity of purpose, and at some point you have to be willing to say, you have to grasp that. So it is about finding the narratives that binds you together, and that growth and development is strongly enough about it, but it has to be a commitment that you basically are held to account to it. And I think that's again what I want to say from China, because the state, you know, we get this illusion of the state can do anything. This may be again helpful. You know, I was a British civil servant. The Belgian civil service, and I'll get in trouble in my own country now, is actually definitely not as strong as the British one. You know, you have different histories of the way the civil service is built up and so on. But of course you need this capability, you need that core. And there's nothing I disagree with what you said. You know, even in Bangladesh, the state was withdrawing from trying to do too much, but it did things. And it still needs to get stronger in getting the economy to regulate, to put in the rules of the game there, to make sure the taxation is being collected, that it's used well, and the capability there. But it's more that you don't overstate that the state will lead everything, because then you end up in that situation where you say, it's not my role, it's not my responsibility, it's just the state's role, it's nothing to do with me. And actually, I don't think in a country like Nigeria, that's actually how it will work. So you can't just rely too much, but please keep on doing like the foundation is doing, strengthening the state as well.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll call on 2 members of the audience. I'd like to call on Kingsley Mogalu, and then immediately after him, Chinwe. And Sam, you have a question.
You are allowing 3.
2.
2. I think we better allow 3 so that we have 1 for a woman.
Chinwe. Just 2. 1 man, 1 woman. Oh, you thought that Chinwe was a man? No. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon. The chairman, His Excellency Chief Obasanjo, Professor Dercon, congratulations on your book. I missed you at Oxford when I was at the Oxford Martin School. I just want to make a very quick comment, and Aig, thank you for doing this. And Peter, welcome. The comment I want to make is about building the elite consensus in Nigeria. And I'll be very quick. There are 4 components of the Nigerian elite. The first is, as we know it practically in Nigeria today, the ex-heads of states, especially the military ones. The traditional rulers, the top traditional rulers, the top politicians, and the top businessmen. You may have 1 or 2 selected media entrepreneurs who may be in the know, beyond what normal journalists know. I see Lady Maid in Hebrew here. So now what is happening is that because this elite in Nigeria has failed to come to a consensus in all the ways that Chief Obasanjo has told us, and also because the state is not functional, the capacity is very weak, as Jaga has pointed out, what may happen is that the youth of Nigeria, out of disappointment, may force a change They are an outside force. They've been kept out. But today, they are bringing their voice to the table, whether the elite like it or not. The danger in this phenomenon is that if it is not carefully managed, it could happen in a way that may not be very peaceful, depending on how the elections go in 2023. I'm just being very honest. So, the point I just want to make is that the elite, especially the former heads of states, I have always felt they can do a lot because they enjoy a very unique level of respect in this country. But they can only do it if they act together. Not one of them can do it acting alone. But if they all come together and speak in a particular direction, perhaps we can make some progress. So we need to begin a more active process where top members of these elite groups that I have identified begin to come together to have a discussion as to where the country should be going. And perhaps we can make progress. But what has happened is that each one of these elite groups, instead they buy into the games of the politicians. And therefore the country has not moved forward. So they're just answering elite, but they're not doing what in Botswana we have seen, that leadership is arranged in clear succession, and it has worked for them. In this country, leadership is produced by a gambling process, and that's why we're backward. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Your Excellency, and many thanks, Professor Stefan, for your insights. Now, Nigeria is regarded by many as the poverty capital in Africa, and there are GDP per capita comparisons that you did make in your presentation with countries like Ghana. And you know, the population size with Ghana is close or estimated to be the same as that of Lagos State, right? In your view, is this a fair metric, given that Nigeria's relatively high population is being compared with those that are not as high? So that's my question.
First. So let me briefly, on the fairness, on the comparison, actually for a moment. So I'm very careful. Yes, you know, Ghana is a small country compared to Nigeria. Ethiopia isn't. Indonesia isn't either. Yes, exactly. Indonesia is a fair comparison. And actually, I would say, you know, there is a lot to learn from actually what actually succeeded in Indonesia that didn't quite succeed here. And I think there the fair comparison is there, that actually the kind of the progress it has had. And there's actually more in common with the oil and related things as well. But I take your point, want to be careful. You know, it's a bit like small and large matters. Can I make a very small point to the point on the gentleman, but I will, of course, let our chair properly answer it. I want to make an analogy here to the Arab Spring. And that actually is really why also in the book I'm very careful about being prescriptive about how change should happen, because of the process that you just described. And why it is actually important that people think carefully about it. Because, you know, the Arab Spring, lots of people applauded it all over the world, the youth rises up, and then it gets totally captured, and it's maybe even worse afterwards for everybody as well. And so that's a little bit where we're doing. So I appreciate your comment, but I'm not going to try to answer it beyond agreement that actually there is something there.
At this juncture, I just want to deal with the point raised by Kingsley, and then bring the discussion to a close. Kingsley, I want to thank you. I think you made one point very clear. And if we do not take that point very seriously, we will all be consumed by the frustration and the anger of the youth. I think you are very, very clear about that. And I don't take that lightly. So, I am not going to play the game of passing the buck, because at a time you were in a group of youth, and even among yourself, you couldn't decide who will be president and who will not. You remember that? Now, that is how bad or how difficult it is. And we should not take these things lightly. Now, in some other countries, former heads of state, former presidents don't stick their neck out the way some of us have stuck out our necks. And that, again, you should understand. For instance, China has come up so often this morning and going into this afternoon. I was in China. A former president of China doesn't go out of China. He does not go out. But he's still virtually part of government. He's given a house, he's given a swimming pool, he's given all the paraphernalia of a head of state, and he stayed in. I went to see one of them who was a good friend of mine because we worked together. And he was telling me what he was trying to do was to try and learn a new language. And when he finished learning French, he will learn another language. That's what he was trying to do. Now, leaving everything to former heads of state, I think would be wrong. And I will tell you this. The first thing, and that is from my experience, a new head of state doesn't want to see is the former head of state. That's the first thing he doesn't want to see. And particularly if he has hand in making him. And the saying, and that confirmed the saying in Yoruba, that the first person a king wants to kill is the kingmaker. So the issue of you being a former head of state and sticking your neck out too much, it can lead to what happened to Obasanjo. Going to prison and just narrowly missing being killed. Now, I think we must bear that in mind. But you have specified 4 different kinds of members of the elite. I don't know whether there are not even more than that, because you didn't talk about those in the, what do you call it, civil society. And they are also members of the elite. Those in the academia, they are also members of the elite. The point, I believe, that we must understand and make clear is that there is need for consensus by critical mass of the elite. Critical mass. I don't expect that everybody will agree to the same thing at the same time in the same way. But there must be critical mass. And that critical mass is very, very important. And that is what I will say. And it's not easy, and we must not. And I don't like. I'm happy that we are not playing blame game. Now we are looking at what is best for Nigeria at this time, going forward, and in the future. Now, at this juncture, I want to thank you, Professor Dercon, for the enlightenment and the insight. Oh, you want me to? Oh, you have something to do again? Oh, is this a question of life and death? If it's not a question of life and death, we will forgo it. What? Oh, there's a life and death question. Okay, all right. There's a life and death question.
The problem is that Nigeria's elites have not actually decided that Nigeria should continue. That is the fundamental problem why we don't have a Nigerian consensus among the elites. Unless that question is addressed, that unity of purpose that I think all of us here agree is needed will not be arrived at. That's the conversation we need to have. Thank you.
Well, that's truly a life and death question. Well, all I will say, my dear sister, is that the conversation has just begun. This is not the end of the conversation. And I will want you to take note of that. The conversation has just begun. This is not the end of it. And I want to thank you for helping us to begin this conversation, which is very, very important and very much needed in the context of our own country. And, but there are three things that I will want us to get to take away, among others. But for me, three important things. One is that the elite has a role to play. The elite has a role to play, no matter how you define the elite. And the elite, you don't have to have all of them to agree on every point, but there must be consensus that the critical mass of the elite will agree upon and be able to move the nation in that, or influence the movement of the nation in that direction. I think that is one thing. The second point is that there must be, is it a focus point? What do we call it? Focus point. Well, focus point, unity of purpose. My brother, my sister here has called it unity of purpose. Whatever we call it, that we can all see and hang on to, hold on to. And earlier on, before we came on to this stage, Atahiru said chapter 2 of our Constitution contains some substantial points that we can all bring on board and hang on to. I said our national anthem and our pledge, all these, there's enough there to give us something to hang on to. At one time we talk of Nigerian dream. What should be a Nigerian dream that everybody will say, hey, look, this is what we are, that hold us together, that gives me aspiration and something to look up to. Number 3 is that development doesn't happen unless it's made to happen. Development does not happen. And both Atahiru Yaga and Professor Dercon made it clear that development must go along with equity. And equity means now improving your living standard. If you talk of development only in terms of GDP and it does not affect the living standard. I went to my village. I'm a village boy. And they were talking of Nigeria economy growing at the rate of 5%. And then I went to my village. I said, well, look, the Nigeria economy is growing at the rate of 5%. And then one of the villagers said, what does that mean? I said, your standard of living has improved by 5%. He said, whoever said that is a liar. Now, he nearly slapped me. He said, whoever said that is a liar. Now, his life has not improved. If anything, it has deteriorated. So how can you now come and say, well, Nigeria economy has improved by 5% to a man who he was making 1,000 naira from his farm last year, and this year he made only 800, and you say Nigeria economy. Now, I think that is important. The other is this issue of the state. State must do what state is best able to do, and others must be left to do what they are best able to do. And I believe that the point that is being made, and I think it has been made by all of us here, is that yes, things are bad in Nigeria. Yes, other countries have done better than we have done. But my own experience is, if we get it right, we can get there even faster than we think we can. Nigeria's situation is not a basket case. Nigeria's situation is a poor management case. And if we improve the management, we will definitely get there. I thank you all for coming.
Well said.
I think they deserve a second round of applause. That was indeed very enlightening. I hope inspiring to you. I would like to invite Aig-Imoukhuede and Aig-Imoukhuede to the stage to join them for...
Yeah, but as we do so, these books are not meant for photographs. They are meant
no doubt. I was just going to get to that. So, compliments of the Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation. You are all getting copies of the book. I think we should clap for that as well, don't you think? So if we have the we have the photographers in place. The Financial Times describes it as an urgent and important book. So do your best to take the time to read and digest it, and hopefully we can create that consensus that we are speaking about here today.
Sure. Just so that
everyone can have
Professor Dercon. Yes. You don't want to work on it? No, I'm actually good. Oh, you want to do this?
In a moment, I will invite a council member of the Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation to step forward to deliver a vote of thanks. In fact, I will just do that now. Please welcome Mrs. Yemisi Ayeni as she does so.
Can we remain seated whilst the vote of thanks is given, please?
Good afternoon, everybody, people who are left in the room. I think I have the easiest task in this room, and that is to say thank you. I say it's the easiest because it's always easy to show appreciation for a great gift. So on behalf of the Leadership Council, the Board of Trustees, and the management of the Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation, let me start by thanking His Excellency President Obasanjo for chairing the discussion so skillfully and for his insightful interjections. Thanks also to Mrs. Omoigu-Okaru and Professor Jega for moderating so excellently. And Professor Dercon, thank you, not just for taking the time to be with us, but for using that time constructively. I think you've challenged us all to think a little bit differently, which I think is good. And to the audience in this room and online, thank you for sparing the time and for being fully present, as shown by the quality of the questions. And last, but most definitely not least, many thanks to all who've worked very hard behind the scenes to make this event happen. Thank you all, and God bless you.
Thank you so much.
some respect when you mention my name. DJ Cypher Lee in the mix.